Project, the first international Winnipeg to St. Paul snowmobile race, is a first. And as I understand it, after talking with many of you here today, it's a first in distance, it's a first in endurance, and probably most important, this, in its international aspect, is a first because it involves the great country of Canada, specifically Winnipeg, Manitoba, and the United States, specifically St. Paul, Minnesota.
Winnipeg to St. Paul, 500 miles under the most difficult conditions imaginable. 57 drivers arrived in the capital of Manitoba on Monday and paid $5 for the privilege of suffering through 4 days of physical pain. Less than half would be able to make it. One of the first to pick up the glove was Herb Howe of Minneapolis. Although some of the drivers were professionals, the rest came from fields which had no connection with snow or racing. Two professional wrestlers, Larry Henning and Harley Race, joined this unusual assortment. One would finish, the other would leave after 11 miles. There was one woman, a housewife and mother of 3. Mrs. Alona Cameron and her husband Jerry started the race at a disadvantage which would never be overcome. The next morning, as the machines were moved into place for the start of the race, the snow snapped underfoot like so many dead leaves. The timer, Joe Jelinek, sent the racers off in waves of 3, staggered 1 minute apart. January 1966, the St. Paul Winter Carnival inaugurated the first annual international snowmobile race, 500 miles from Winnipeg, Canada to St. Paul, Minnesota. This was to be the most extreme test of the snowmobile industry. 57 unmodified machines were entered, 24 finished. The Polaris Company of Roseau, Minnesota captured 5 of the first 6 places to establish its dominance for endurance and dependability. The winning time was 13 hours and 36 minutes. The week of the race was the coldest of the season, as temperatures dropped to 35 degrees below zero and strong winds caused near blizzard conditions. And now the Polaris Industries presents the International Snowmobile 500.
I open this meeting by saying welcome to each and every one of you here tonight. It goes without saying this is obviously a very intrepid, brave, courageous bunch. I don't want to scare anybody, but I think that each and every individual here this evening has to be complimented, because this project, the first international Winnipeg to St. Paul snowmobile race, is a first. And as I understand it, after talking with many of you here today, it's a first in distance, it's a first in endurance, and probably most important, this, in its international aspect, is a first because it involves the great country of Canada, specifically Winnipeg, Manitoba, and the United States, specifically St. Paul, Minnesota.
Winnipeg to St. Paul, 500 miles under the most difficult conditions imaginable. 57 drivers arrived in the capital of Manitoba on Monday and paid $5 for the privilege of suffering through 4 days of physical pain. Less than half would be able to make it. One of the first to pick up the glove was Herb Howe of Minneapolis. Although some of the drivers were professionals, the rest came from fields which had no connection with snow or racing. Two professional wrestlers, Larry Henning and Harley Race, joined this unusual assortment. One would finish, the other would leave after 11 miles. There was one woman, a housewife and mother of 3. Mrs. Alona Cameron and her husband Jerry started the race at a disadvantage which would never be overcome. The next morning, as the machines were moved into place for the start of the race, the snow snapped underfoot like so many dead leaves. The timer, Joe Jelinek, sent the racers off in waves of 3, staggered 1 minute apart. The positions were decided from the draw from a hat. The temperature was 20 degrees below zero as the face masks jutted into the 15-mile-an-hour wind blowing from the southwest. The wind chill temperature, which is the best way to measure the amount of discomfort, was 47 below. At that temperature, any portion of exposed skin would freeze in a matter of minutes. Some of the drivers didn't realize just how terribly disabling extreme cold can be. But before they had traveled many miles over the harsh Canadian countryside, they would be given a lesson not soon forgotten. Almost everyone would be nursing frostbite by Crookston, 160 miles due south. The first man to drop out made only a scant 40 yards before his gas line froze. This was caused by one of the misunderstandings which occur in every race. Harland Urevig of Minneapolis was told not to use special gas additives. The race committee did not consider de-icer an additive, but Harland apparently did. A special lift truck which followed behind to take in the disabled vehicles hoisted the first of many snowmobiles onto its bed. The disappointed driver looked on. Less than a mile down the road, Larry Pretty Boy Henning was also off to a bad start. His carburetor had frozen, and it looked like the Minneapolis wrestler had lost the match to the weather, but as it turned out, this was just the first fall. The odyssey of Larry Henning would follow a long, obstacle-filled trail before finally ending on Rice Street in St. Paul. The shadow of this vulture truck would be on Henning for the rest of the day. It caught his partner, Harley Race, just 11 miles from Winnipeg, and a dozen others fell out on that first 160 miles. Among them, the KSTP entrant, a Muscat, which unfortunately fell to mechanical difficulty. The race for the rest started out as everyone had expected, the snowmobiles plowing through the ditches along the side of the road, the drivers getting up on the road shoulder only when some obstacle blocked their way. And then someone, no one knows who, found that the shoulder was much faster, and before long everyone was flying along right next to the pavement. Canadian Mounties stood guard at the roads and bridges to protect the men, but there was no one who could turn the wind or warm the leaden sky. The cold cut like a knife. The tortuous wind sliced through parkas and gloves and boots, and it brought a pain never before felt. After an hour in this frigid hell, some had been pushed to the end of their endurance. Shaking hands ripped to free the skin from the frozen mask and hood. Eyelids had been nearly shut tight by the clinging ice. The U.S.-Canadian border served as another spot to slow the speeding snowmobiles. Each machine made a token stop and turned in a customs pass to satisfy Canadian law. And then a few hundred yards up the road, they made another stop to assure the American authorities that they were just racing and not smuggling in Crown Royal. From the border to Halleck, Minnesota, they ran wide open. And at Halleck, they stopped for gas. The snowmobiles carry a 4-gallon tank, not enough to cover the 160 miles. In fact, many of them ran dry before Halleck. The people who had donated the gas, the Skelly Company, had been told that each machine could get at least 25 miles to the gallon. At full throttle, 15 miles per gallon would have been a better estimate. These problems were all ironed out by the start of the second leg. While the gas was being dumped into the tanks, more than a few were using the same time to make adjustments or even to change spark plugs. While nearly half the drivers were still 50 miles from Crookston, two brothers were scampering over the finish line in unbelievable time, 4 hours and 28 minutes, 2 hours under the predictions made in Winnipeg. The speed with which these two maintained their pace caught the officials by such surprise that the sign to designate the end of that leg had not even been put up yet. Jerry Brown, the race chairman, had barely beat the snowmobiles to the finish line. Since this was a race against the clock, the first man across the line was not necessarily the winner. Clayton Brandt of Roseau, driver for the Polaris Company, posted the best time. His brother Edson, although first to cross, was 10 minutes behind him. Herb Howe finished in good time too, but it was the Brandt boys who captured the spotlight. If they could hold their machines together, they would surely finish 1 and 2.
What about this brother race that you're having now? Your brother's in second place. What is this becoming, kind of a family competition?
Well, we kind of started this before we left, and I told him he was going to drive awfully hard to beat me, and I think he's going to do it from here on in. This machine he's got has always been a trifle bit faster than the one I've got, and I think he's really going to prove it from here on because he's not going to give up for nothing. He rolled over and smashed his windshield and lost his cushions, and he wouldn't even sit still long enough to put a cushion back on. He drove that thing 20 miles sitting on the bare steel.
I come into, I think it's Argyle or one of these towns, and my throttle stuck, and I couldn't get the thing stopped, and I cut across the yard and into through a jungle gym and hit a chicken coop, and before I managed to corral the thing and get it stopped.
You got a little frostbite on your cheeks, it looks like.
Right. After I hit that chicken coop, I lost my windshield, so I come about the last 65 miles without a windshield, and at about 40 below, I imagine, of about 30 miles an hour, you can realize how cold it is.
What about the weather? How much did that affect you yesterday?
It started out being a little tough. My eyes kept freezing shut because I wear contact lenses, and as they watered, they'd freeze shut and I couldn't see. So I stopped quite a few times. I tried goggles and they'd steam up, and finally I guess I got used to it. And then the next thing was fingers and toes after that. Other than that, the rest of me was warm.
Are you going to finish this race?
All I can do is try.
How's your machine running?
Beautifully. There's nothing wrong with the machine except it had a little trouble with the cold, too. Icing up. My throttle was stuck wide open, and I had no brakes. The only thing I could do when I saw something ahead is shut off my motor and start all over again.
43 snowmobiles were able to come to the starting line in Crookston the next morning. The weather had warmed up slightly to a mere 10 below. Today's goal, Fergus Falls, 110 miles to the south. And before the day would end, another dozen drivers would be out of the race. This was to be the most difficult leg of the Winter Carnival 500. The distance was 50 miles less than the first leg, the mercury not as low, but the private furies which plague snowmobile racers had divined a west wind to pick up the powder snow and carry it right into their faces. The course itself contained more curves, which made the driving tougher and which threatened to cut the speed to a fraction of that attained on the first day. The blowing snow cut the visibility to less than 100 feet in many places. But the leaders, Edson and Clayton Brandt, after starting deep in the pack, moved quickly out in front. Edson, wearing number 30, again took first position. He was 15 minutes behind his brother, according to the clock. The other drivers, far to the rear, were having serious problems. Many were hitting mailboxes, rolling over in the ditches, and burning off skis from running on the hard road shoulder. Edson had found a groove just where the shoulder turned into the ditch. He was averaging 39 miles an hour and hitting top speeds of 50 and more. A couple of 100 yards behind, Clayton had found the same groove and was moving well and holding his lead. The brothers ran almost wide open for nearly 100 miles. Then the skis began to wear on Clayton's vehicle. 10 miles from Fergus Falls, with the ski worn all the way through, the snowmobile flipped and came down in the ditch with Clayton under it. With a bone on his shoulder broken, he finished the second leg, but his brother had moved into the lead now. Edson had wheels added to the front of his machine, and he was clocked crossing the finish line at 52 miles an hour. His time for the 110-mile second lap, 2 hours, 57 minutes. But his use of the wheel attachment started some rumbles among the other drivers, and a special drivers' meeting was held that night.
In talking in terms of wheel attachments, you will recall that in some of the original letters that you received, we made the statement that wheel attachments, or at that time, I think we'd call them no snow or bare surface attachments, would be optional. I'm compelled to say this. I would hate to see the Winnipeg to St. Paul International Snowmobile Race, and bear in mind I say snowmobile race, turn into a motorcycle race. And as the chairman of this endeavor, it's my decision now to say that wheel attachments will not be used for the next day and a half of this race.
The rising sun at Fergus Falls brought only light, no warmth. It was 30 below as the 32 remaining drivers moved to the starting line. Among those out, Clayton Brandt, his shoulder broken but still second in the standings, even with that serious accident. The woman racer, Alona Cameron, had caught the other racers in Fergus Falls, and although hours behind the leader, she was ready to start the third leg of the race. The extreme cold kept one vehicle from igniting, and he too was forced out of the competition. Lines of cars crowded the side of the road to watch these drivers strike out for St. Cloud, 124 miles away and 1 day closer to the finish. Edson Brandt remained in first place with a comfortable lead over the others. Mr. and Mrs. Cameron started off together. Even though they had a mechanic right with them and even though their spirits were high, they had no chance of catching most of the other machines. The moment the first snowmobile moved out of the ditch and onto the road, this became a race of horsepower. Mrs. Cameron's snowmobile had only a 10-horse engine. Nearly everyone else was driving 14s. Even if she had the skill necessary to keep up with the leaders, her vehicle did not have the capability. For her, this became a personal challenge. She would not abuse her snowmobile, and with a little luck, she would finish the race, a feat more than half the drivers would not accomplish. Her husband had sacrificed any chance he had to win so that he could ride the 500 miles beside his wife. The first 2 days had burned up 100 pairs of skis, and many of the drivers had now returned to the ditches in order to save the runners, but they did so at a sacrifice. The other machines whizzed by on the shoulders. But even here, the going became difficult. Cuts had been made in the pavement to allow runoff during rainstorms. To hit one of these at 40 miles an hour on a snowmobile is a bone-jarring experience. There were few alternatives, however. The ditches were almost as rough. This third day was marred by the only serious accident. 16-year-old Steve Zakar of Manitoba, the youngest driver, was going on the shoulder, lost control, skidded onto the pavement, and smashed into a highway patrol car. The machine was badly damaged. He was shaken up and out of the race. But next morning, he was on the starting line for the last leg. The streets of St. Cloud were lined with spectators as the 27 remaining contestants crossed the line. The physical exertion was starting to tell now, though. Everyone was tired. A snowmobile on pavement can only be controlled with brute strength. Only determination could force the tired muscles and the aching backs to the effort needed, and then the reaction was slow. Larry Henning had only one good day. He finished 5th at St. Cloud. Tomorrow he would be plagued with mechanical troubles and would be the last to cross the finish line, but cross he would. After the third day, Edson Brandt was more than an hour ahead of second place. His lead seemed insurmountable. Many of the machines were in bad repair. Herb Howe had almost not finished. A piston had frozen up, and he took half the night to get it fixed. He thought he would be able to start, but it was doubtful whether he'd be able to keep his snowmobile running for the 74 miles to St. Paul. Many others were working late that night. Jerry Cameron didn't want to drop out at this late stage. He tuned and checked both his vehicle and his wife's. Carla Oggs, the Queen of the Snow, dropped the flag to start the last leg of the race. 27 were still in contention, but it looked as though Edson Brandt would be able to hold his hour and 3-minute lead over Herb Howe. They started together, and Howe jumped into the lead. Brandt seemed content to hold a steady pace at around 45 miles an hour. He went well for the first few miles, passing most of the early starters. And then he began having trouble. The metal cleat on the belt which drives the machine began tearing loose, and his speed began to fall off. Ahead, Herb Howe knew nothing of this. The only thought in his mind was the hour and 3 minutes he had to make up. Finishing was not enough. He wanted to win. He pulled the throttle as far as it would go, ducked under the windshield, and began to eat up the miles. He went by the other drivers like they were standing still. To everyone connected to the race, Edson Brandt seemed a sure winner. Even with a breakdown, his lead was too great. Most of the other drivers had given away any hope of first place. Their only victory would be finishing. The exception was Howe, but even to him, the task must have looked impossible. Still, he guided his machine around the earlier starters, counting to himself as he went. There couldn't be more than a couple in front of him now. No one remembers second place, he said. He hadn't come all this way to be forgotten. Now there was only one man in front of him. He must get around and into the open. And now he had passed them all. With a little luck, he would be first to cross the finish line. And if he could just push a little harder, he might eat into that hour and 3 minutes. Anoka had been set aside for the gas stop. He had to stop for gas, but it took time. Even the 30 seconds he wasted there was much too long. He yelled at the crew to hurry. A twist of the cap, and number 50 was ready to start again. In his desire, he made mistakes. Too wide on a turn, into the street, and time to get back on the shoulder again. The cold was starting to get to him, too. Earlier, he had been frostbitten in the fingers of the left hand. Now it was starting to bother him again. But there was nothing to be done. He was more than halfway to the finish line now. Brandt had been forced to stop, but Howe had no way of knowing this. He couldn't let up now. He seemed to be going frustratingly slow, yet he was clicking along at almost 50 miles an hour. And he had no way of knowing if last night's hasty repair job would stay together. Just a few more miles now, it would be over. His skis were almost worn through, but there was no time to stop. The finish line couldn't be more than a mile away. And there it was, Rice Street and the Ramsey County Sheriff's Station. It's history now, the fall of Edson Brandt, the determination of Herb Howe. The dramatic finish, with first and second place just minutes apart. In years to come, the great race of '66 will be relived in 1,000 conversations on 100 cold nights. They'll talk about a man named Herb Howe who wouldn't quit. They'll dwell on the heartbreak of Edson Brandt, the leader for 3 days, and his brother Clayton, who wanted to drive with his shoulder in a sling. The courage of men like Steve Zakar, Gordy Nevers, and a woman named Alona Cameron, who will not soon be forgotten. They rode the Winter Carnival 500. Program was pre-recorded, produced by Bob Farinacci and Morris Hurley. This is John McDougall speaking.